Welcome to Lesson 2, Add Rational Expressions. For our lesson today, you will be taking what you learned in your last lesson, how to find a common denominator, and you will use that in order to help you add rational expressions together. So, here's an example of adding together two fractions without common denominators. We have 1/2 plus 1/3. As you know, you need to get a common denominator before you can add those together. In this example, our common denominator was 6. So what we did is we multiplied each fraction by what was missing. Well, we have the 2, but we don't have the 3 to make the 6, so we multiplied it by 3/3. In our second fraction, we had the 3, but we were missing the 2 in order to turn this into 6, so we multiplied by 2/2. That's basically what we're going to be doing today, only with rational expressions like this. It's the same practice, use the same skills. You're still going to multiply each fraction by what's missing in order to have common denominators so that you can add the numerator. We're going to be trying 5 different examples today. So what I want you to do is write down each of these examples so that you have these in your notes so you can refer to them to help you when you're solving problems in the practice. Okay, remember that we need to start with step 1. So step 1 says to find the lowest common denominator. In order to find the lowest common denominator, you remember that you need to take both denominators and you need to factor them. So we're going to take a 2x and factor it into 2 times x. And then we're going to take the 7x squared and factor it into 7 times x times x. And then we're going to take what we have in the first denominator, which is 2 times x. So our lowest common denominator is going to be 2 times x. Then we look at our second denominator and see what's missing. Well, we don't have a 7, so we need that 7. We have 1x right here, but now there's a second one, so we're going to need that one as well. If we multiply all these together, 2 times 7 is 14, and x times x is x squared. This would be our lowest common denominator. Now we're on to step 2. So step 2 says that we need to adjust our fractions so that we are using the lowest common denominator. And the way we do that is we look at our first fraction, which is 4x plus 1 over 2x. We look at our denominator, 2x, and we compare it to our lowest common denominator of 14x squared. Sometimes it's easier to keep the lowest common denominator in factored form so you can see what's missing. Well, we have a 2 and an x, which you can see right here, a 2 and an x, but what are we missing? We are missing the 7 and another x. So what we need to do is we need to multiply our first fraction by 7 over x. And remember that this is a fancy form of 1. 7 over x divided by 7 over x is just 1. So we're not changing this at all. We're just getting it so that we have the lowest common denominator. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. In order to multiply 4x plus 1 by 7x, we need to use the distributive property. So we're going to take 7x times 1 and 7x times 4x. So that would get us 7x plus 28x squared. And then 7x times 2x is 14x squared, which makes sense because that is our lowest common denominator. Okay, good. Now we need to do the same thing with our second fraction. So our second fraction is 5x minus 2 over 7x squared. Let's go ahead and look at our denominator and see what's missing. So here's our lowest common denominator. What do we have? Let's underline what we have. We have a 7 and we have 2 x's. So we have this x and we have this x. What's missing? It looks like just the 2 is missing. So let's go ahead and multiply the top and the bottom by 2. When we do that, we need to make sure that we distribute the 2 into these parentheses. Be very careful to put your numerator in parentheses when you are multiplying something into your numerator. So we have 2 times negative 2, which is negative 4, and we have 2 times 5x, which is 10x. Our denominator is 7x squared times 2, which is 14x squared, which again makes sense because that's our lowest common denominator. Now if you'll notice, both denominators are the same, and we can add our numerators together. Okay, let's go ahead and write this. So what we have is 7x plus 28x squared minus 4 plus 10 all over our common denominator of 14x squared. Okay, so step 3 then would be to add together our numerators. This is really just adding like terms. We have a 28x squared. That can't be combined with anything, so we can write that by itself. Then we have a 7x, which cannot be combined with anything. But then we have a minus 4 and a plus 10. That gets us 6 all over 14x squared. And now we have successfully added together our two rational expressions and combined them into one. Let's go ahead and try our second example. Okay, let's go ahead and factor 24x squared. Well, 24 is 2 times 12, but I know that 12 is not completely factored. So what is 12? 12 is 3 times 4, and the 4 can be factored as 2 times 2. And then we have x squared, which is x times x. 6 can be factored into 2 times 3, and then we have the x. So what's our lowest common denominator? Well, remember that we need to take everything in our first denominator. So let's go ahead and take the 2, the 3, the other 2, another 2, and both x's, and compare. Well, let's look at the 2. We have a 2 right there, so we don't need to add another 2. Here's a 3. We already have a 3. We don't need to add that. And x, we already have an x. So we don't need to add anything to our lowest common denominator. Our lowest common denominator will then be 24x squared. If you look at the problem, 6 goes into 24 and x goes into x squared. So 24x squared is a fine lowest common denominator. Okay, let's go ahead and do step 2. Let's adjust our fractions so they have both of them as our lowest common denominator. Well, our first fraction already has that, so we don't need to adjust it. But our second fraction, x minus 1 over 6x, is missing some things. So let's see what it's missing. Well, we have a 2, we have a 3, we're missing this 2, we're missing this 2. We have the x, but we're missing this x. So we are missing 2 times x, which is 4x. So all I need to do is multiply the numerator and the denominator by 4x. Remember to use parentheses for your numerator. 4x times x is 4x squared, and 4x times negative 1 is negative 4x. Then for our denominator, we have 6x times 4x, which is 24x squared. Now we're ready to add our fractions together. So we have our initial fraction of 5x plus 24x, which we can add to this. So let's combine our numerators. We have 4x squared minus 4x plus 5x over 24x squared. Combining like terms, 4x squared can't be combined with anything, so we just write that. A minus 4x plus a 5x gives us plus x all over 24x squared. Okay, if we look at our numerator, in this case, you can see that you can actually, once we've combined everything, you can look at refactoring things out. Notice that we have an extra x that we can factor out from both, which would leave us with 4x plus 1. And on the bottom, we actually have 2 x's. If we wanted to simplify, we could simplify by taking this x and dividing it into this x, so taking 1 away. Our final answer, simplified answer, would be then 4x plus 1 over 24x. But notice that we can't take the 4 into the 24 because 4x plus 1 is a binomial. It's connected. We can't take pieces away. The only reason we took the x away was because we factored it out of the binomial. Great. Let's look at another example. In this example, we need to go ahead and factor both of our denominators like we've done previously. Okay, so now we have factored each of our denominators. X squared minus 4 is a sum and difference, is a difference of squares, so we factor it into x minus 2, x plus 2, and x minus 2 is already factored. So if we look at our lowest common denominator, we're going to go ahead and take the x minus 2, x plus 2, and then we look at our second denominator, x minus 2, and that's already in our lowest common denominator, so we don't need to add another one. Now let's go ahead and adjust our fractions so they'll have our lowest common denominator. Well, our first fraction, you can see, already has this lowest common denominator, so it does not need to be adjusted. Our second fraction, though, is missing part of our lowest common denominator. If you'll notice, it's missing the x plus 2. So what we need to do is multiply x times x plus 2 and x minus 2 times x plus 2. So we would distribute and get x squared plus 2x on top over x minus 2, x plus 2 on the bottom, which is our lowest common denominator. Now we're ready to add our fractions together. So if we add in our original fraction, x minus 1, and remember that we have the same denominators, so we can add our numerators together. Let's do that. We end up with x squared. 2x plus x is 3x plus 1 all over our lowest common denominator of x minus 2, x plus 2. And we can write it like this, or we can write it as x squared minus 4. Great, that's another problem. Let's go ahead and work through another example. In this example, again, we need to factor our denominators to find our lowest common factor. So our first denominator of x squared minus 36 can factor into x minus 6, x plus 6. Our second denominator, we can pull out a 3, and we are left with x plus 6. So, finding our lowest common denominator, remember we're going to take the denominator, factored denominator of our first fraction, and see what's missing. Well, when I look down here on the second fraction, we are missing a 3, so let's go ahead and put a 3 here. But x plus 6 is already in our lowest common denominator, so we don't need to add that. Now, let's go ahead and write our fractions and multiply by what's missing in order to have a lowest common denominator of x minus 6 times x plus 6. In our first fraction, our lowest common denominator is 3 x minus 6 x plus 6. You can see here that we are missing the 3. So we would want to multiply the top and bottom by 3. And remember to keep your numerator in parentheses so that you can properly distribute the 3. 3 times 4 is 12, and 3 times 2x is 6x. And we know what our lowest common denominator is now going to be 3 times x minus 6, x plus 6. For our second fraction, we have a 3 and an x plus 6, but we are going to be missing the x minus 6 right here. So we need to multiply the top and the bottom by x minus 6. Well, we take 5x times x, which is 5x squared, and 5x times negative 6, which is minus 30 times x, all over our common denominator of 3x minus 6, x plus 6. Now we are ready to add our numerators together. So let's go ahead and write them. We have 12 plus 6x plus 5x squared minus 30x all over our common denominator. And if we go ahead and add these together, our like terms, we have a plus 5x squared that can't be combined with anything. So we'll write that first. I'm writing these in order from highest degree to lowest. Then we have a 6x plus 5x, which is 11x, minus 30x, which is 19x. And then we have a positive 12 here on the end. And then we can write that over our lowest common denominator of 3x minus 6, x plus 6. Good. Let's do one final example just to make sure you feel comfortable. Okay, in this example, let's go ahead and factor our denominators. If you'd like to pause the video at this time and try this on your own, now would be a good time. When you factor the denominators, the first denominator is already factored, so you get x plus 5. The second denominator is a quadratic, which we would have used grouping. When I factored by grouping, I got x plus 5, x plus 3. So let's write our lowest common denominator. We use the x plus 5, and then we see what extra we have down here. Well, here's an x plus 5, so we don't need to rewrite that, but we have an x plus 3. That's extra. So our lowest common denominator would now be x plus 5, x plus 3. Let's adjust our fractions so they all have their lowest common denominator. For our first fraction, x over x plus 5, what are we missing? We are missing an x plus 3. So we would want to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by x plus 3. If we do that, we get x squared plus 3x for our numerator over our lowest common denominator of x plus 5, x plus 3. Notice I'm keeping these binomials in parentheses when I put them together. For our second fraction, we don't need to adjust this because x squared plus 8x plus 15 is the same thing as x plus 5, x plus 3, which is already our lowest common denominator. So we're ready to add our fractions together. We have x squared plus 3x, then we have 2x from our second fraction, all over our lowest common denominator of x plus 5, x plus 3. Okay, adding like terms, I get x squared plus 5x over x plus 5, x plus 3. And in this example, you could factor out an x from our numerator. X leaves you with x plus 5 all over x plus 5, x plus 3. And by doing this, then you can see that the x plus 5 binomial can cancel with the x plus 5 binomial, and our simplified answer would then be x over x plus 3. So always look at your final answer and see if there's any way you can simplify it. But remember, you don't want to simplify it until you have combined your two rational expressions together. And that concludes our lesson today and our 5 practice problems on adding rational expressions together.